Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is your captain, Randy Wright, speaking, and as always, I'm joined on our state-of-the-art radio program by my first officer, Jeremy Grapington. Folks, this will be the final boarding call, so if you please, claim your seats, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show while Jeremy and I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, because there really is a lot of news and information to get to before we may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, if there's something that has been a rather consistent trait with respect to this 2016 presidential election thus far, it's that the dark horse candidate Donaldus Julius Caesar Trumpus has managed to work a bit of magic with people. He has pulled the wool over the eyes of even conservative pundits like right-wing radio talk show host and personality Rush Limbaugh. And there's one thing that Rush has been parroting on his show for the past several episodes, which has caught my attention. It's something where he says that the phenomenon you're seeing with the base of the gutless opposition party, or GOP, working against or following Donaldus Julius Caesar Trumpus is a response to the so-called class warfare that is going on within the rank and file of the Republican Party. And, you know, that made me think that perhaps there's something we need to cover on this program, a topic that no other radio program or venue has been covering. And that is this topic of a shifting perception of class and wealth in popular culture and society in general. You know, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, famed filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille tried to make a few films depicting working-class life. They flopped because audiences wanted to see films about the well-to-do. The fans of DeMille, and he had a rather extensive fan base, wrote to him explaining that they wanted depictions of the wealthy to inspire them to become wealthy themselves. In other words, the people of that time would have never accepted a candidate like Sanders or Clinton. And I don't think they would have accepted a candidate like Donaldus Julius Caesar Trumpus either, because even though Trumpus makes no bones about being a very wealthy individual, he does attack the infrastructure by which others become wealthy. And he did turn to the government to prop up wealth and to create wealth. And that is what he believes that the government should do. And the people of America at the turn of the 20th century, and basically up until the 1930s, even though there was that stint of progressivism that existed from 1902 to about 1919, the people themselves were ardently against that. These politicians were lying about what their intentions were, particularly with respect to politicians like Woodrow Wilson during the First World War. But, Jeremy, I think you have noticed this too, how there's been kind of this shift in perception where people are starting to go after those who are wealthy, including the wealthy.
Sure. It's, you know, it's almost like it's the ultimate game of semantics. You know, do as I say, but not as I do, because if you do as I do, you'll never reach that level at where I'm at.
Right.
See, people like Trump put themselves up on a huge pedestal. They talk down to individuals, but at the same time, it's almost like he's reprogramming them. Much to the tune of how those films that you were talking about with C.C. DeVille,
mm-hmm.
You know, his fan base, it's almost like they were programmed because of popular culture, because of society. It became social norms, you know, much like political correctness. And that's what's happening. It's almost like, you know, Trump talks about, you know, I'm not politically correct, but yet he's using the same logic and the same foundational building blocks of political correctness to create his own form of political correctness and his own social wave. And like you point out, it's happened all through it. It's always happened all through history. but more so within the United States at the turn of the 20th century and even on up to today.
Right. And I think that a lot of what this shifting demographic view, and not even just demographic view, just the shifting popular view that the people have had with respect to wealth and class in this country has been due in large part to the efforts of the Fabian socialists who began infiltrating the pillars of society back at around that time. And it's interesting because if you look at popular culture now, particularly with Hollywood and the big movie idols, moguls, and icons, they are pushing this type of, oh, it's the one percenters that are holding you down, never mind the fact that I'm a one percenter. Or like the filmmaker Quentin Tarantino, who made those horrific statements about police officers and supporting that communistical movement known as Black Lives Matters. It all interrelates to this, and it shows that there is this type of moral decay that is plaguing the United States right now, and it ties into this. And I think that Donaldus Julius Caesar Trumpus is perhaps a symptom of this disease. It goes to show that the American people, yes, they are angry. There is no doubt that the American people are angry at the status quo in this country right now. The problem is they're allowing their emotions to get the better of them. You know, it's okay to have righteous indignation and righteous anger, but it must be tempered with logic and reasoning, because if it's not, then you run the risk of falling prey and victim to a strongman. Just look at the powerful and popular dictators of the 20th century. The Benito Mussolinis, the Adolf Hitlers, the Pol Pots, what have you. They all played off of this cult of personality that was directly linked to this sort of anger that was brewed up amongst the people. It's as though the Fabian socialist types constantly fan the flames of discontent in order to push their message forward. But remember what Rahm Emanuel, the current mayor of the city of Chicago and the close friend of Barack Hussein Obama, said: you never, ever let a crisis go to waste. And I think that's what we're seeing unfurling before our very eyes.
Well, it wasn't just Rahm Emanuel that said that. It was actually Cass Sunstein as well.
Yeah.
And, you know, the whole point is, again, this is, you talk about righteous anger, righteous indignation, and when emotions are allowed to dictate that righteous anger and indignation, it's no longer righteous.
No,
it's no longer dignified. It becomes blind fury, and that's what it is. And there's a very distinct difference between the two. It's almost like, you know, take a schoolyard bully, and you have a schoolyard bully. You know, he has his weakling, his victim, his punching bag, and every time he gets a new one, it's almost like they don't want to stand up to him. And usually it only takes one good pounding in the schoolyard for that victim to toe the line, because they don't want to suffer the wrath of that potentate, that bully. So they'll do whatever they can to avoid that, which means they'll bend at every whim, hang on their every word, follow them around as like mindless drones, because it removes their ability to think for themselves pertaining to logic and reasoning.
And, you know, there's something to be said about that as well. There used to be a moral compass that existed within the United States where society wouldn't tolerate the twisted machinations of a charlatan who was trying to pull the wool over their eyes. There was this idea of being self-accountable, self-responsible. And, you know, that's deeply rooted in the inception of this country that occurred over 230 plus years ago. It goes back to the natural law tenets that underpin this entire representative Republican form of government of ours. And we can see that the perfect embodiment of that is our shared Constitution. You know, folks, that is why Jeremy and I, going back to our pilot episode, pun intended, on September 11th of 2015, we said that the key to all of the problems that are currently facing the United States is the Constitution. Now, folks, that's not mere rhetoric. That is absolute fact. You look at the Constitution and it tells you exactly how you are supposed to run the proper scope and application of government. And all of the major problems that we're suffering right now is because at every level of government, from local or municipal all the way up to the federal government, have gone out of their way to divorce themselves from the proper scope and application of government as dictated by the clear and concise language contained within the four corners of our shared Constitution. And of course, you're not going to hear this from the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media, because they don't care. In fact, if they were to espouse this message, it would obliterate the propagandistic message that they are wanting to convey. It would take away the power and ability for them to manipulate, as they have been ever since William Randolph Hearst created yellow journalism and even pushed the United States of America into war with the Spanish-American War of 1898.
Sure. And, you know, it reminds me, going back to, let's use Hollywood again as an example. It reminds me of that classic movie with Charlton Heston, The 10 Commandments, when he goes up on Mount Sinai to get the word of God, the law. While he's up there, you have all the Israelites running amok, total havoc, doing what's popular, because one or two potentates, I believe Dathan was one of them, was saying,
right.
we'll create our own law. We don't need this. We could do this. We, they worship the golden calf. There's fornication, adultery, all these things going on, all of these sins, because they thought it was popular to not have a set rule of law. And to me, there's an equalization there with the 10 Commandments and the United States Constitution. It's both are rooted in natural law. Absolutely, undeniably, it is irrevocable that is the fact. And when it's presented to the people, they don't want to follow it. And there was punishment handed down because they turned away from it. That is what's happening to our country now. You see this wave of popularity, this populist movement going
populism,
on.
absolutely.
Populism. And that's exactly what it was with the Israelites there after fleeing Egypt. It's the same thing here.
Yeah.
It's because they want to do what's popular. Doing what's popular is a form of evil in and of itself, because you can do what's popular, but it doesn't mean that you're doing what's right. You have to do what's right first and foremost.
Yeah,
above anything else.
Your principles must guide everything. And Jeremy, it's interesting that you mentioned the Charlton Heston film of the 10 Commandments, because that was actually a remake of a Cecil B. DeMille movie called The 10 Commandments, dating back to the silent era. And that ties it back into this message that we started with respect to the early films of DeMille, where he wanted to try and depict working class life, and the people didn't want to have anything to do with it. And I'm using that as an illustrative example to demonstrate how there was a shift that has occurred since then. And, we have to ask what changed. Somewhere along the way, American perceptions of class and wealth drastically shifted for the worst. And we can see that in the way that Hollywood now portrays movies. They always portray the rich in bad light. Think of The Wolves of Wall Street, things of that nature. It's drivel, it's worthless. I hate to see it, and I haven't been to the movie theater in years, pardon, and that's partly because of the type of filth that is being peddled as popular culture today. And it really is a reflection that some aspect of the American character and spirit, that indomitable force that pushed us to such lofty heights in our relatively short yet illustrious history. The resplendent nature of the American people had always been that we could not be stopped, that we could be anything that we wanted to be so long as we put our minds to it and we had the God-given talents to do so. But that's been lost. And I've seen an acceleration in the decay of these moral fibers that apply to it, particularly in these last two disastrous terms of the Barack Hussein Obama regime.
Sure. And again, we could substantially point directly to some of the tentacles that have caused this. Revisionist history, indoctrination, political correctness. All three of those things are the root of this culture shock, this culture shift into populism. And it began, as you stated, back at the beginning of the 20th century, you know, with individuals like Woodrow Wilson, individuals like Hoover, FDR.
And we will be expanding on that as we go a little bit along. Yeah. It's, you know, at the start of the 20th century, most Americans lived on farms and ranches. Their survival completely depended upon a strong work ethic. And society shunned those whom they considered lazy or degenerate. Life was hard, but the people were independent. And, you know, that was a continuation of the same frontier and pioneering spirit that our founding fathers had brought to the surface. That was the very spirit that helped give birth to this great representative republic of ours. And you see, going on to the point that you made about revisionist historians, they have played into erasing that history by polluting the minds of the up-and-coming generations, and indeed those generations that have yet to be born, with the sort of indoctrination that we've seen. You know, this praising of the Fabian socialist-inspired progressive movement, the attempts to tear this country apart at the seams and replace it with this diabolical socialist dream, this dystopia that they want us all to accept. And, you know, it has no place in an open and honest society like that of the United States of America. But people are so caught up in their day-to-day lives, as the great visionary Zygmunt Dobbs warned about in his magnus opus, Keynes at Harvard, when he said that the average person would be so caught up in just the mere sustenance of survival that they would not have the political capital or time or energy to expend in order to stay on top of things. And that's what the Fabian socialists are banking on. And I think it's the same type of thing that Donaldus Julius Caesar Trumpus is banking on with his supporters as well. He knows that everyone's so caught up that they won't necessarily take the time to look into his past, to see the consistent inconsistencies that follow him like a shadow. Of course, in this day and age, it should be very easy for someone to look into that, but it means that you have to have the energy and the wherewithal and the willingness to just pick up your smartphone or go to your computer and run a couple of Google searches on it.
Sure. And, you know, to couple all of that, individuals like Trump, they will always reiterate their own personal accomplishments and actually set them as a bar for other people to obtain. So what they're essentially doing is they're giving this false message of making America great again by telling people we're going to win. We're going to be wealthy. We're going to do this. We're going to have money. We're going to all this other stuff. And I know this because I'm rich. People know I'm rich, and I'm rich because I'm a winner. He sets them up with these platitudes, and then he raises the bar to an unachievable and unattainable standard just to keep them coming back for more. This is the classic bait and switch. That's exactly what he's doing. Remember, folks, he's a businessman. He claims to be a great negotiator. I think he would wet himself if he was in the room with Randy and I and several individuals that we know. But it's the classic bait and switch. He sets people up with a level, saying we're going to do this, this, and this, and then he raises the bar to where he knows they can't achieve it, but they don't understand that, and they will do everything they can within their power to support that in hopes of possibly achieving that. It's kind of like, a Buddhist trying to achieve nirvana. Mm-hmm. A true Buddhist knows you can never achieve nirvana. It can't happen. But when you have someone who says, oh, I'm a Buddhist, I practice Buddhism, and I'm going to, achieve nirvana and that great enlightenment, they're setting themselves up for failure because they're allowing themselves to be duped. They're allowing themselves to fall victim and to succumb to that type of rhetoric to where they want to, everything's dangled in front of them. And then just like that, it could be taken away with one reversing message or a boomerang, so to speak, of I'm rich, I'm a winner, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. So it automatically wants people, he's getting people to jump up to that, but they'll never reach that level. It's right. Because they won't allow themselves to reach that level because they're too engrossed in the populist movement of Trump is going to save us or whoever's going to save us. And that's part of the problem. People don't want to take the responsibility and the acknowledgement and the reality that it is not up to anybody to be elected to save us and preserve our rights. It is our obligation as sovereign citizens.
And to go into the things that have changed, let's look at what politically the people were going through in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Politically, the people had suffered through nearly 2 decades of failed progressive presidents. As you mentioned, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, to name a few. World War I saw the rise of Bolshevism and the dominance of organized and subversive labor with groups like the Wobblies, meaning the International Workers of the World, the Teamsters, the AFL, and CIO unions, because they were separate at that time. They were demanding to drastically change the business atmosphere of the United States. They wanted to bring forth socialism and even full-blown Marxism in the heart of the United States. And they were willing to implement violence to do so. A lot of people are simply unaware of the fact that during the late teens, there was a first Red Scare, particularly in 1919. There was an organized movement that sent bombs to the floor of the Capitol building, to the Attorney General Palmer's house, and he responded with what became known as the Palmer Raids. And then it came to a culmination in the 1920 Wall Street bombing, which, by the way, was the worst terrorist attack on United States soil until 9/11. Mm-hmm. That's major. And by the way, it's still officially unsolved. It's still an open case. But there were these anarchist elements, particularly of Eastern European immigrants that came over, that were pushing for anarchy, which was sort of an offshoot of the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviki were trying to use that for their own gain to start a revolution in the United States. And then we saw in some of the presidential elections at that time, and from the American polity of the time, certain nefarious elements like Eugene V. Debs, who tried to run for president to then push the country into full open Marxist rebellion and revolution. In fact, He had been arrested for his subversive plots against the United States and ran for president from prison. So if anyone's thinking that Hillary Clinton may have problems with this email scandal being able to run, nah, it's not the first time we've had somebody do that. In fact, Eugene V. Debs, as I just mentioned, was in federal prison when he ran. So it's not going to stop any of that. And, you know, it's interesting. After the Palmer raids and the bombing and the first Red Scare, we saw that the American people were concerned, rightfully concerned. They were seeing their way of life under a direct assault, under an intentional attack by these rabid left-wing fanatics, and they were angry. They were very angry at the time. And the election of 1920 proved to be pivotal because we had just gone through all of the attempts of the Woodrow Wilson administration to, again, fundamentally transform the United States. If that language sounds familiar, it's because it ought to. But we see that that was going on, and the Republicans were at each other's throats. The election of 1920 was contentious and heated. We had a true constitutionalist that was running in Calvin Coolidge. We had kind of a wishy-washy establishment type in Calvin Coolidge, and I don't remember who the other one was that was running at the time, but you had a very contentious race. And guess what it came down to? It came down to a brokered convention, and Warren G. Harding, who only managed to secure 6.7% of the delegates from the popular vote, clinched the nomination in the convention because it went to a brokered convention, and he somehow went on to win the general election that November against the Democrats. But at that time, people were so fed up with the Democrats because we had Woodrow Wilson for so long, and then we had progressives since Teddy Roosevelt. So it went Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, then Woodrow Wilson. And so, as you can see, there were 3 administrations that led to that. And here's an interesting fact that a lot of people don't talk about with respect to Roosevelt running with the Bull Moose Party. They think that was just the name of the party. You know what the official name of the Bull Moose Party was? The Progressive Party. The Progressive Party. So we see that they were willing to double down on that. And we go to the brokered convention in 1920, and we have Warren G. Harding. Now you'd think, Harding, okay, he'd be a good president. He wasn't awful, but he wasn't great either, because he was mired with corruption. Scandal upon scandal hit his regime. His stress went up, his health failed, and he died suddenly in 1923. And then his vice president, who had been running against him, that being Calvin Coolidge, served out the remainder of Harding's term, cleaned up the corruption, and won in his own right in the election of 1924. And what was so amazing about Coolidge, and I know, folks, it may seem strange that I'm talking about a president who was in office 92 years ago, but it's important. Under Coolidge, America had a committed constitutionalist for the first time since James K. Polk. Okay? So we're talking 1840s. Mm-hmm. As Coolidge rolled back the unconstitutional measures of the progressives, the economy boomed. You know, optimism.
The Roaring 20s.
Yes, optimism soared, and more Americans became wealthy than ever before. The American dream felt secure. Americans started their own businesses at record rates, and industry boomed. Every American dreamed they could get rich. And this was all because the chains and shackles of government were removed, and the 20s became forever known, as you mentioned, as the Roaring Twenties. You see, folks, you can see similarities between that time and this time right now. We have two progressives. George W. Bush, I don't care what people say, his second term, he clearly was a progressive. And then with Barack Hussein Obama's two disastrous, terms for his regime, is an absolute die-in-the-wool Fabian socialist progressive. And so America right now in 2016 is where it was in 1919. Mm-hmm. We are on the precipice of falling apart. We're on the precipice of losing everything. In fact, the Great Depression started initially 10 years early because of the failed policies of Woodrow Wilson, but Harding slowed it down. The problem was, if Harding hadn't passed away and had continued down the path of corruption that he was, it would have happened by 1925.
And I think there's a striking point that needs to be made with regard to that era, with the booming economy, the industrial age, the Roaring Twenties, the growth in private business. Again, all of that was done because of the efforts of an individual that did not speak about populism, but spoke about adherence to the Constitution and the elimination of corruption within the government. Now, here we have an individual running this time around that does not speak about populism, speaks specifically for strict adherence to the Constitution and the elimination of cronyism and corruption within our government. That individual being Ted Cruz.
Mm-hmm.
Now you take the other individual, the other candidates running that actually have the potential of getting the nomination, which would be Donald Trump.
And that's about it.
That's about it. He speaks about populism. Again, he's creating this fad that is wrapped up in this whole shroud and facade of anger. People are angry. Well, you know what? People were angry because of Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. This is why we got Warren G. Harding, due to a brokered convention. So Warren G. Harding was a populist.
Mm-hmm.
He was involved in populism, the culture shock of this, culture shock of that. In fact, I believe Warren G. Harding actually had dealings with an individual named Edward Bernays, who happens to be a Fabian socialist.
Mm-hmm.
Edward Bernays had this social experiment back in, I believe it was the late teens, early 20s,
mm-hmm.
where back then it was socially unacceptable for women to smoke in public. And he ran a social experiment to where he encouraged women to go against the social norm to smoke in public. And it became a fad. It became popular.
Mm-hmm.
It became a sense of prestige for women to smoke in public, especially at social events, not just walking down 34th Street in New York or Rodeo Drive, but going to social events. It became a new social norm. It became a popular thing to do. All because,
that along with lifting their skirts, lifting their skirts, and all of the whole flapper movement was born out of that social experiment.
Right.
In fact, that was the first sexual revolution.
Mm-hmm. Which Ayn Rand actually spoke about as well,
mm-hmm.
Quite a few years later.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the novels of F. Scott Fitzgerald,
mm-hmm.
The Great Gatsby, it was all about that time. and
Sure.
this sort of backlash that was happening culturally. But at the heart of it, you had the big government religious types, and I'm not anti-religion, not at all, but people that sit there and say they can't believe that certain factions of the evangelicals would go for Trump, I can. Do you think that the Christian temperance movement has died completely? I don't. The Christian temperance movement was the one that brought us prohibition. They were the ones that brought us government control in an unconstitutional fashion, because the 18th Amendment was dubious in the way that it was passed. It was rushed through. It didn't go through the Article 5 requirements like a bunch of the amendments at that time. And it was, once again, just kind of this blind rage on the part of them, because they saw these social experiments by the Fabian socialists, and they were being reactionary to it. And they were doing whatever they could to try and stem that tide. And that resulted in Prohibition. Now, what did Prohibition give us? Organized crime.
Bootlegging.
It gave us all sorts of deaths that were unnecessary. It literally ripped the heart out of the country. And it was, again, this sort of misguided anger.
It gave us the Kennedy Revolution, too.
It did. It did, because Joseph Kennedy was a bootlegger.
Yes, he was.
That's how he got his fortune, and that's how he got his start. And to tie this back to Cecil B. DeMille, one of Cecil B. DeMille's starlets of the time, one of the best-known starlets of the silent screen, was Gloria Swanton. She wound up being a mistress for Joseph Kennedy.
Ooh.
So, you see, all of these things interconnect. And that time period is not that different than our time period today. We see it with the efforts in California now to once again push to have the smoking age lifted to 21 as a form of prohibition, to make electronic or e-cigarettes the same thing as cigarettes, even though there's been nothing to prove that they're deadly. It's water vapor. And we see the same type of anger playing out in the evangelical movement as they see the Obergefell decision bring out gay marriage, forcing it onto the states through unelected judges. And the same type of repercussions are there. And the backlash is going to be there.
And the backlash is actually going to be much worse.
Oh, of course it is.
It's going to be much worse.
Pent up for a much longer period of time.
Well, not only that, but just for the simple fact of the communications and how fast information travels now.
Yeah.
It's going to make it more rampant. And it's going to be catastrophic. But again, the push for technology, and technology is a wonderful thing, folks. We're not bashing technology. If it didn't exist, we wouldn't exist here. But the point is, it's taking something like technology and using it for destructive means or evil means. And when I say this, I'm talking about the elimination of cursive handwriting in schools and kids actually being taught and passed through school for printing, not only printing words, but using text to speak. It's the dumbing down.
If you look at our logo, that's actually my cursive handwriting. I hand wrote this. I created this logo. Kids are not learning how to do that anymore.
No. And see, what's sad is there's individuals that are our age, or maybe even 5 years older, that can't even read cursive handwriting. They can't even read it. It doesn't make sense to them. It doesn't register, because they don't understand the concept behind it. If it's not printed or if it's not butchered in some form of technological shorthand, they can't comprehend it.
Mm-hmm.
And they get frustrated with it, which turns them off. And by turning them off to that, instead of them wanting to learn it, they revert back to what they have been made to feel comfortable with, and they re-embrace that even more, and they just entrench themselves deeper into that evil seed. This is all part of the plan with indoctrination, political correctness, and revisionist history. It all works hand in hand with each other.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, when we look at the close of Coolidge's second term, the American people sought to secure their prosperity by electing a political outsider and businessman, Herbert Hoover,
Mm-hmm.
in the 1928 election. Now, Hoover had been a successful mining engineer, and he sought to make private industry more efficient because he thought that there was a lot of waste, that there was a lot of excess that wasn't working right, and he wanted to make things more efficient by promoting deal-making and partnerships between government and industry. Now, folks, that should sound very familiar to you, because if we look at this 2016 presidential election cycle, we see that Donaldus Julius Caesar Trumpus has come out and claimed, one, that he's a political outsider, two, that he believes that we just have stupid people in government, not people that have actually been designing the deleterious effects that have been plaguing this country, but he thinks they're just stupid people, and that business and government having this partnership, this close interrelatedness, would be beneficial. That is basically the same message that Herbert Hoover was preaching in 1929, or at least in 1928 when he was getting in for the election. And today, what would we call that? We'd call that crony capitalism. And is that not what the American people are sick and tired of with respect to the government?
Sure. You know, you take that and you couple it with this, you know, blind fury of, well, we're angry at the politicians and Trump is not a politician. Newsflash, folks. Trump has been a politician his whole adult life.
Trump is as much of a politician as Herbert Hoover was. Now, Herbert Hoover did hold some cabinet positions that Trump didn't. But before that, the way that Hoover got those cabinet positions was that he funded politicians.
He bought his way in.
Yes. And so we see that Hoover also redistributed his personal wealth and encouraged Americans to do the same. We've heard all of the stories that Donaldus has thrown out to show himself as being this magnanimous, exemplary figure that just gives money to people who deserve it. Because let's say the firefighter who rescued a woman from a car that was on fire on a roadside, there was some story like that where he gave that firefighter $100,000, and everybody's look at how generous and compassionate he is. Or most recently, the thing where he was going to war with the Fox News channel, which is a deplorable example, where he used the veterans as a pawn, and he said, oh, I raised all this money for them, but yet now we're seeing reports that the veterans haven't even really gotten much of that at all.
Yeah. It's again, we have to go back and look at history, and that's the whole crux of this episode, is to bring historical facts up to current speed and make the comparative analysis that we're doing, because history repeats itself. History is, aside from pain, and people think I'm nuts when I say this, pain is the ultimate teacher. Next to pain is history. And folks, if you think for a second that history is not painful, you don't know history. You don't know history.
Very painful.
So
and I say this as a historian, an attorney and historian.
And I'm neither of such, and I understand this.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be said that, again, we are failing as a nation to pay attention to the follies of history. Therefore, we are most assuredly condemned to repeat them. It's going to happen because history dictates as such. It's inevitable. You know, whether it's our generation, whether it's 10 generations from now, if by the grace of God, we stave off this imminent pain that is going to befall our country, if we stave it off, eventually it will hurt us. Eventually it will hurt us. And the biggest thing that I have that I'm afraid of, not really afraid of, but that it's not so much of a fear.
It's more of a concern.
It's more of a concern is that our future generations are not going to be equipped with the knowledge and understanding to combat this. This is why we do what we do. This is why we put ourselves out there so that those of us that have forgotten things in history or that have turned a blind eye to history and ignored it completely can regain our bearings. We can right the ship and set us back on course to the preservation and perseverance of our constitutional representative republic. Mm-hmm. It's our duty and obligation to do this. It's every one of ours. Mine, Randy's, yours, everybody. This is our country. And if we allow it to go to the way of history and allow that pain to ensue, then we have no action but to endure that pain and to accept it because we have failed ourselves at that point. We have nobody to blame but ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And history shows that we've had the visionaries who have warned us. Look at Zygmunt Dobbs. Yep. Look at Archibald Roosevelt. Yes. They both warned us of
George
Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Madison. All of our founding fathers warned us of this. And we're seeing it. And then looking back at Hoover, because if you recall what the revisionist historians try and say, they try and say that the Great Depression occurred because Hoover was continuing the laissez-faire policies of Calvin Coolidge, that by not having government intervention, that is what caused the Great Depression. Well, no, it's not true, because what we see from the actual primary sources, from letters and journals and newspaper reports at the time, is that the increased partnership between government and industry led to risky lending and investment practices. Now, that should sound familiar with Donald Trump. Go back to 2009 when he applauded the Obama regime for bailing out the banks. Now, isn't this funny? He attacks Texas Senator Ted Cruz, saying that he's owned by the banks, but he was the one that said the banks were too big to fail. He was the one that was loaned money from George Soros, the notorious and nefarious Fabian socialist, to help him when he was going through his financial difficulties and to help build one of his towers. I think it's one of the casinos, if I'm not mistaken.
Trump Plaza?
Yeah, that's a casino. Yeah. And so he is owned by George Soros. So all these people that are sitting there saying that Donaldus Julius Caesar Trump is self-funding, first of all, he's not self-funding. He's lending himself the money. He will then pay himself back out of the campaign. You know what that's called, folks? Money laundering.
Embezzlement.
Yes. larceny by trick. That is what that is. So it's bumpkiss when he says that he's self-funding. But back to the Hoover connection. So we see that ultimately these risky investment practices and patterns destabilized the stock market, leading to the Wall Street crash of October of 1929. Then we know that ensued 8 months after Hoover assumed office. And everybody's like, well, he didn't have time to implement his policies. No, he had enough time to encourage that sort of corruption. He basically revived the corruption of Warren G. Harding. And within 8 months, it caused the collapse. Then, to basically bring the economy back or to infuse it, Hoover implemented Keynesian economics. Now, isn't that funny? Isn't it funny? We've mentioned this. By raising trade tariffs via the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Now, where have we heard tariffs again recently?
Trump.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna put a huge tariff on China and a huge tariff on Mexico. They're gonna build a wall and they're gonna pay for it. Well, that's kind of what Hoover was trying to say. We've got this huge failing economy. You know what? All the foreigners are going to have to pay for it. We're going to put a tariff on them. Oops. It didn't work. It just worsened the depression. But that's not the worst of what Hoover did. Everybody that says Hoover was this laissez-faire guy that was against the government touching things off, well, how's this for small government? He increased the top income tax bracket by nearly 23%. It went from 23% to 46% overnight. And that made the depression even worse.
Well, sure. Because what that did was that automatically invoked spontaneous speculation, and that's what the markets are based on, is speculation. Mm-hmm. And individuals don't understand this, that the price of a commodity or a stock, well, it all depends on who in the world is willing to pay X amount of money for it.
Mm-hmm.
When you take something to where those commodities and stocks are taxed because they're bought and sold and traded and so on and so forth, you can thank Woodrow Wilson for that. When that tax is doubled, the speculation goes through the roof,
mm-hmm.
which artificially inflates the prices and values of those stocks and commodities. And then when people try to collect on them, there's nothing there to collect and everything is lost.
Yeah. The only saving grace they had in 1929
gold
was the gold and silver standard. They had the bimetal standard.
Yeah.
When that happens now, which we're already seeing the market repeat what it was doing then, because of the constitutional uncertainty, just like we were having then, it wasn't the market alone. It was government policy and practices that were extra constitutional that caused this. The market was just a mere symptom of it. But now we have what is known as fiat currency. Mm-hmm. A dollar is worth a dollar because the government writes you an IOU note. That's meaningless. That's not going to stop inflation.
No, in fact,
we're already seeing
it'll create hyperinflation.
Of course it will. And we're already starting to see the effects of it. We have been all throughout the 2 terms of this Barack Hussein Obama regime. And so after he raised the taxes, you have to wonder, what was he raising all of this for? Oh, once again, for a Keynesian economics idea. The Hoover Dam? It's named after him. You know why it's named after him? It was a public works project that he put in place, saying that government spending will stimulate the economy. Does that sound like laissez-faire, or does that sound Keynesian?
Well,
Sounds Keynesian, because it is.
You know what else it sounds like? Cash for clunkers.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Cash for clunkers. We're going to infuse X amount of government dollars and tax dollars, raise taxes to generate all this revenue so that we can create jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sure, the Hoover Dam created jobs, but at what expense? At what expense? Well, the expense was eventually the stock market crashed. The economy crashed.
Well, so, no, the economy had already crashed.
Yeah,
this was his response to it.
But later on down the road,
it crashed
even worse again, even worse, because of those economic policies and those business/government deals that were put in place. It was just a matter of time before they fully played out. And that's what happened later on. I believe it was 1937. Later on, when the market crashed again.
Yeah.
In one of the worst ways. And it was all stemming from that. You know, I have this idea, and it's actually, if you think about it and look at it and go through and do the history, every president that we've ever had, given that they've either served one term of 4 years or 2 terms of 4 years, whatever policies they implement, it takes 4 years before that policy to come to full fruition. So that means that it's the following president automatically has to deal with that, whether it's good or bad. If it's good, they'll ride that tidal wave. If it's bad, they take heat for it because it happens on their watch. Perfect example of this, 9/11. 9/11 was orchestrated by individuals that remained in the United States for a period of 8 years. The first attack on the World Trade Center happened in February of 1993, a month after Bill Clinton took office. He did nothing to seek them out, did nothing to rectify the situation at all.
Mm-hmm.
8 years later, these individuals regathered, rethought their devious plans, and then launched another attack in 2001 after Clinton had left office. All because of his failed policies of handling a domestic terrorist attack.
Yeah.
It makes it goes in line with that. It goes in line with these business government deals, you know, these social experiments, so on and so forth. There's a timeline to where there has to be a threshold before things take place.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that FDR came in 1932 as a response to this. And he had the New Deal. And it was just absolutely disastrous for the country because he doubled down on the New Deal, which created this Fabian socialist type mentality, the entitlement spending with Social Security and the safety nets. And that was a disaster for the country as well. And we see that it further entrenched the problems facing the country. And it was all a result of the Keynesian economic theories and principles that he was doing at the time. And FDR doubled down on it. And that just made things worse. That led to the second crash that you mentioned in 1937.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we all know that FDR didn't stand for constitutional principles and policies.
Yeah,
he was absolutely against them. I mean, he was probably our first full-fledged socialist. I would say that he is. Woodrow Wilson, full-fledged progressive, and Fabian, and it morphed into Fabianism, if you look at when it began back in the 1880s, it kind of retarded itself and regressed from full progressivism to socialism under FDR. But then they quickly realized, well, gee, that's not working. So we're going to ratchet it back up to progressivism. And then lo and behold, we had individuals come about like LBJ. So you have people like LBJ and the Great Society. LBJ, the individual that was completely opposed to civil rights legislation, every chance he got, all the way up until the point to where he became president, he stood against and railed against civil rights legislation. Then lo and behold, he becomes president. One of the first things he does, stroke of a pen, signs civil rights legislation into law.
Yeah, why would and that was part of his Great Society, too.
That was part of his Great Society. And that is a progressive tactic. So from FDR jumping up to LBJ, FDR was, again, one of probably the most prominent socialists we ever had in this country.
Yeah, in fact, nerdface Bernie Sanders had defined his democratic socialism off of the New Deal. In fact, he said that we needed a new Deal.
Yeah.
Well, why would we need a new Deal if the last New Deal was so great? It goes to show that these Fabian socialist policies fail, and they let the country down. And it works against and operates against we the people at every step of the way. Sure. And this absolutely goes to that notion of the changing perceptions that the American people have with respect to wealth, prosperity, and those who have risked things to achieve it. All of a sudden, it went from being the ideal that we wanted to live for, that we wanted to strive for, that we wanted to achieve, to something that we now say is unfair.
Or something that is unattainable because certain elitists, certain potentates, despotic little wannabe dictators tell us, well, that's not what you should strive for. I'm a winner. I'm rich. You could be like me if I allow you to. That's where it comes down. Hitler pulled those same tactics. Pol Pot did the same thing. Lenin did the same thing. Stalin did the same thing. It's all cut from the same book and cloth of Fabianism. This is why I said Fabianism pushed on progressivism. And then with FDR, they retarded themselves back to mere socialism and then realized it didn't work with FDR. Come LBJ, they ratcheted back up to full-blown progressivism again. And they've been bouncing back and forth, tweaking it this whole time to figure out what works. We had movements like, the hippie movement. Peace, love. Really?
Peace, love, free drugs, free sex, all of that.
All that. I'm a free spirit, flower power, all that nonsensical crap. And now those individuals, they had a mindset change.
Yeah, and when you going back to FDR for a second, the bank foreclosures and the bailouts turned average Americans against the wealthy. They thought it was the wealthy colluding against them. And that's the same message that Donaldus Julius Caesar Trumpus is purveying and conveying, and yet it's the same thing he's doing. It's the same message that he's preaching.
Again, bait and switch.
You're absolutely right. It is a bait and switch. And then what's so fascinating is at that time with FDR, you had this split. The American people wanted to attack the wealthy, but they still wanted to be a part of it. They didn't trust them, but they wanted to be a part of it. And you see this with the publication of famed lawyer and entrepreneur Napoleon Hill's book, Think and Grow Rich.
Yep.
That was published during the Great Depression, at the height of this first detachment from the original American spirit and dream of pushing for being an entrepreneur, for pushing to be wealthy, to achieve whatever you set your mind to. That was the quintessential, indomitable, inconquerable American spirit. And that is what we have steadily marched away from as these torrents of progressive ideology and mentality descend upon the country, strangling the life out of the entrepreneurial spirit. You know, if you think back to the start of the 20th century, there was a Doc Harold. This was a guy, Charles Harold. He was the first radio broadcaster. He created his own radio broadcasting equipment that he called the arc phone. It used arc lamps under alcohol to create a steady stream of electricity over which broadcasting AM signals could be broadcasted out through the air. And it's funny, you'd appreciate this, Jeremy, since we're getting to be microphone aficionados. The microphone that they used at that time was just a regular carbon telephone that was directly hooked up to 500 volts of direct current.
Wow.
And they had to water cool the microphone. There was water running through the microphone constantly, but that was what they used for the microphone. And the way you'd say I was on air, you'd take the receiver off the hook. Mm-hmm. That was your mute button, was to put the receiver on the hook. Mm-hmm. And they'd play phonographs. And anyway, he created a college on his own. You couldn't do that by the 1930s. You couldn't just go out and open a college. You can't do that now. And it steadily changed to where the government came in through these Fabian socialist progressive types, regulating the channel calls that you could have, regulating what frequencies you could broadcast on, what equipment you could use with the invention of the vacuum tube by 1913. And so by the time you get to Roosevelt and the New Deal and his fireside chat, the government had so much control over the air through the FCC that he could interrupt broadcasts to run his message.
You mean much like in a devious way that Hitler interrupted newspapers by and print shops by going in and pretty much holding a gun to people's head and saying, you're going to print this or we're going to kill you?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That's what I thought. Now,
now we see it with the internet.
Yeah. Net neutrality.
Funny how history repeats itself.
I want to touch on this college thing. That, with this individual creating the college with the arc phone and the broadcast and so on and so forth. But I want to roll in Napoleon Hill in his book, Think and Grow Rich. See, there has been a fad over the past 30 years of wealthy individuals who are self-made millionaires, this or that, and they put out these programs to teach people, you could be successful. You just have to follow my simple plans, my syllabus, if you will. And you too, if you think it, you can grow rich, this and that. A lot of these individuals took Think and Grow Rich and they bastardized it.
Just turn your phone off.
And they've switched things around to where it's to the point now to where, again, it's a double standard. It's telling people one thing and then setting the bar so high that they'll never obtain it, but they'll do everything they can, including emptying their life savings in order to get to that plateau.
Right.
Trump University comes to mind. This is exactly what it was all about. He created this so-called University, which, by the way, folks, the Better Business Bureau has actually come out and confirmed that he had a D- rating.
Which is atrocious.
D- rating. Okay. This Trump University was designed to teach people how to invest in real estate or to open a business to become Trump-like.
Mm-hmm. And see, the difference between Trump University and, say, the Herald School of Wireless and Broadcasting was Herald actually taught these kids how to do Morse code on the Marconis, the wireless radio operations. He had set this other thing up as an experiment. I wonder if we could do voice over the airwaves.
You mean the individual that set this up was actually qualified and teaching them what his realm of expertise was?
Yes.
And not somebody who was not qualified, had no background whatsoever, but was given a script to read to people over the phone when they spend X amount of dollars to call in for technical support because they had questions or on these conference calls.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he was an inventor. Mm-hmm. He had made his first fortune in 1905. He invented things like a deep sea diving light that was integrated into the diving helmets of the time. Mm-hmm. He created surgical instruments, and he created wireless devices. Before that, when he was growing up in the 1890s in San Jose, he invented a sand-driven, clock-driven telescope so that when the grains of sand would fall out slowly over time, it would stay on track on whatever position you set it on in the heavens. He had invented that at the age of 15.
Wow.
He was just an incredible entrepreneur.
You know what that gave way to and actually led to? Missile guidance systems.
Yes, the gyroscopic missile guidance systems, yes. And he had done this in the 1890s.
Phenomenal.
The 1890s.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
It's that. See, that is the type of entrepreneurial spirit, true Americanism that this country has lost. Mm-hmm. That's what we need to get back to. And, wouldn't you know it, Randy, back in the 1890s, people actually gave a damn about their constitutional rights and actually lauded the government for adhering to the Constitution and sticking to it, not creating these backroom deals or these governmental policies that were going to intertwine things to make things extra constitutional.
Right.
That eventually would devastate our economy and disrupt our social order and rule of law.
In fact, one of the students that volunteered to help him create this lamented the fact that the government came in and regulated it. He said, then they wanted to know everything. They had to put it a certain way and whatnot. And you know what made him stop after 12 years of being the first to broadcast on a daily basis?
Government intrusion.
Because of World War I. It also took and pooled all of the patents together. In other words, all of your intellectual property rights were lost so that it could improve the technology that the government could use to wage war, so you lose your patent.
But the government says that under the Constitution, they have the right to regulate and promote the sciences and the arts. Really?
Not like that.
Not like that.
And here's the thing. His business was promoted by the record company out there, the phonograph company. They loved it because he would play their music over the air, and they said the next day all of the wireless operators would come in and sell out their records, buy out all of that tune. So they would lend him records to use. That is capitalism.
In its purest form. Not only is it capitalism in its purest form, it's the most ingenious way of marketing known as word of mouth.
Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the last inventions he had, and sadly it was never used but it was a brilliant thing. He had a cam system set up for a gear-driven system for the streetcars, so that as they would go down the road, it would mechanically change the advertisements on a roll so that you could see different advertisements. He did that in 1939.
Wow.
So he was just one of those types of entrepreneurs, and that's the same type of mindset that you got from Napoleon Hill, who was told to go and do this formula by Andrew Carnegie.
Mm-hmm. And then all of that was taken, again, with intrusion by nefarious individuals, to where they twisted it and morphed it into their own version in order to subvert people and create a serfdom. Because that's what this is. Trump University, you can think of it as, a separate kingdom, so to speak, that eventually was conquered, but it created a serfdom. It created a ruling class over people who, the willful entrepreneurs and emptiers of wallets, so that they can, feel part of that creation, so they can have a sense of belonging, a sense of self-worth. This is one of the most detrimental things that has ever hit our culture, ever hit our shores. When you have to buy into something in order to have a sense of self-worth, you have nothing. You have absolutely nothing. It is nothing but a sham.
Right. And, you mentioned the hippie movement, and, to tie this into the little tangent that we had there with entrepreneurism, we saw that with the time of Richard Nixon, we already had LBJ's War on Poverty, which was once again stifling the entrepreneurial spirit, stifling with regulations and increased governmental expenses and costs.
Which was one of the fundamental building blocks of the hippie movement, because people, I can't create a business, so I'm just going to live free and happy.
Yeah. So Richard Nixon comes in. Watergate controversy made people not trust the wealthy even more, because, again, the press gleefully labeled the corruption as the result of wealth and greed. And Carter won in 1976, offering to increase spending on behalf of the poor. Again, predictably, the economy tanked and the size and scope of government ballooned out of proportion. And we see this go on again and again. The American people then wanted to be wealthy and prosperous again in 1980, so they threw their weight behind Ronald Reagan after he had done a brokered convention in 76 against Gerald Ford, which allowed Carter to come in. Well, the reason was Ford wasn't standing up for the Constitution, and that, at that time at least, that was what Reagan was pushing for, and we got away from it.
Yeah.
And in fact, Reagan himself got away from it in his second term, and that led to a lot of the disastrous consequences that we saw with George H.W. Bush. Read my lips, no new taxes.
Yep. Which then gave way into
Clinton.
The Clinton era, where in 93 he had the capital gains tax initiative, the no-doc loans, adding teeth into the Carter's Community Reinvestment Act, and then spurring later on in his second term, towards the end of his second term, the Frank Dodd, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, that whole debacle, no-doc loans, ninja loans, all that nonsense.
Then we had the dot-com bubble.
Yep.
All of that played in to all of a sudden there was this perception that the wealthy, the 1%, they're crowding it in, they're denying us, they're depriving us. And then George W. Bush made it worse in 2008. We have the fiscal meltdown the worst since the Great Depression. And he bails out the banks.
Yep.
He can't let the market correct itself as the Constitution would have us do. He interferes. And that makes it worse. And that strengthened Barack Hussein Obama. And that allowed him to come gallivanting into the White House. And then we had the cash for clunkers, the Solyndra deals, all of this crap that we have suffered through these disastrous 2 terms of the Barack Hussein Obama regime. And so you see, folks, history is playing out in its great circular form. It is cyclical by nature when we do not learn from our past mistakes. And so if we were to compare Donaldus Julius Caesar Trumpus to any past candidate or president, it would be Herbert Hoover.
Well, I think it would be Hoover, FDR, LBJ, Carter, Reagan in his second term, Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., all of them lumped in together.
But specifically, it would be Hoover, and here's why. The tariffs, the tax plans, the healthcare plans. He's inheriting a disaster, yes, but he's going to make it worse, just as Hoover did. And folks, it won't even take 8 months if he's, by some stretch of the imagination, able to get in, because he's not going to be able to get in, because there are enough people who realize what he is, that they're not going to vote for him. I believe there's a poll that's out that said, what, 70% of conservatives can't stand the schmuck and won't vote for him?
You folks, you think it was bad with McCain and Romney when conservatives did not go out to vote? It's going to be tenfold. It's going to be tenfold. At that point, all this so-called anger that people are using on their sleeve as their emotion, that you haven't seen the likes of anger yet.
No.
And anger, again, anger is an emotion that is brought on mostly by pain. See, we felt just a little bit of pain. If I can make an analysis here to the level of pain, you know, how the doctor says, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, what's your pain level? Well, at this point, it would be probably a 2 or a 3. If Trump is elected, even if he's not elected, even if he's just nominated, that pain level is going to go off the charts. And then, folks, you will see what true anger is. You will see an anger that is not had any equivalency since the American Revolutionary War, when the British tried to disarm the colonists and tried to stifle the colonists and tried to take the colonies back as serfdom. Yes. You want righteous indignation and anger? That's where it is. That is what righteous indignation and anger is, folks. You haven't seen it yet. This is not true righteous. Again, this is blind fury. That's all it is.
Blind fury.
Yes.
A blind fury that is going to push us over the precipice into destruction. And what makes it even worse is those that will sit there and justify this on saying, well, you know, Ted Cruz is a politician. Irrespective of the fact that he has stood up to the detente wing of the gutless opposition party time and time again, when he has been the sole voice, that when the Senate couldn't block the Gang of Eight, he was the sole senator who went to the House of Representatives and got the Freedom Caucus together and said, hey, you need to block this, and I'll help you. He was the only one. Meanwhile, at that time, Donaldus Julius Trumpus Caesar was sitting there saying we couldn't send back those who had been here illegally. And now we already hear him mentioning touchback amnesty again. If you look at the art of the deal, or as I like to call it, the art of the steal or the art of the squeal, he said that you take the most outlandish, hardline position when you approach the bargaining table, and then you steadily whittle away back from that. That's what he's doing. He is playing the American people as pawns and dupes in his game. Yes, like a Stradivarius. To steal a line from Rush today, who was singing the praises of Donaldus. You see, Rush has been playing both sides of the issue here. But that's playing with fire. Because he talks about the anger, he ain't seen real anger yet. Because what they are doing now is, if we could compare Cruz to any past candidate in this comparison of the history that we're really doing here, this is why I said Hoover is Trumpist, while Calvin Coolidge is Cruz.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no other candidate out there saying he's going to stand up for the Constitution.
There's no other candidate out there that has actually stood up for the Constitution. He is the only one, the only candidate. And see, I offered up this question to an individual on Facebook today. And he says, Trump's going to win. It's he's going to win handily. It's going to happen, blah, blah, blah. I told this individual that Trump could not even beat Tickle Me Elmo.
No.
He can't. And he says, well, do tell. It's very simple. Number one, Trump cannot formulate coherent, structured sentences. He can't stay on point. He goes from one topic and interjects me, I'm rich, I have lots of friends, this and that. People know it. They know, I know it, they know it. Trust me, I'm rich. And then he'll go back and repeat his initial statement.
Yeah, rinse and recycle.
Right. Trump, this is the livelihood and the perseverance and preservation of our country. This is not Head and Shoulders being utilized in the shower. Okay? So stop. Number two, he cannot beat Hillary Clinton in a debate. Here's why. Trump may be calculating. Trump may be brash and abrasive and balls to the wall, right blunt in your face. Hillary is patient. And I say this, and I have proof of this, because for the simple fact that in 2008, the end of 2008 and 2009, when she was tapped as Secretary of State, I made the point. Why would she surrender a seat of power, being a New York senator, for a position of temporary authority and power? The only logical reason was she was going to make a run for the presidency.
Mm-hmm. It's a stepping stone.
It's a stepping stone. I told people this. People said I was nuts. They said, you don't know what you're talking about. And lo and behold, who do we have that is going to be the national or the nominee for the Democratic Party? Hillary Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's because she's patient, because she took 2 steps back and bided her time so that she could pounce when she was ready to. Trump does not have that kind of reservation or patience. He's too arrogant. His hair won't allow him to be that way. It's the truth. Trust me, folks. It's the truth. I know this. They know it.
Yeah.
That is why he will fail.
And again,
the thing is, when he fails, he's not only is he going to be the loser, but the biggest loser of all is going to be this country.
Yes.
Period.
And it all goes to something that needs to be said. In this time of quagmire, in this time of peril, and in this time of destruction in our country, we don't want a Herbert Hoover. A Herbert Hoover would give us everything that is wrong. And with Donaldus Julius Caesar Trumpus, he fulfills every caricature and stereotype the left has done about the right. Look at this Michelle Field story, where there's now video evidence of Lubwinski, or what's that jerkwad's name?
Lewandowski.
Lewandowski.
Yeah.
Okay, that Lewandowski thug bruising this woman, tearing her down, and his excuse being, well, I thought she was part of the mainstream media. It doesn't matter. The First Amendment allows them to ask that question. She was non-threatening. She belonged to Trump Bart News, since we can't call it Breitbart anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But their spokesman stepped down over this, folks, because of the way Breitbart was handling it, because Trump said that they were lying, because Lewandowski said it didn't happen and that she was just making this up. No, folks, she wasn't just making this up. And I'm going to make this demand right here and right now. Trumpus, you fire that thug right now. You do it right now. Cruz did it for much less with his campaign director. It's communication, public relations director. It's time you do it with your person who has committed assault, because Michelle Fields has filed a police report and is pressing charges. It is time for you to disassociate with this criminal who was arrested for illegal possession of a loaded firearm when entering a government office building.
Wow.
It is time for you to fire him, and we are going to make this demand over and over and over again until you do it.
Oh, and if you think you're safe from us on Twitter, no, because see, we're going to send you messages demanding this. Oh, and by the way, not only are we going to demand this, but we're going to hold you accountable for your rhetoric during some of your rallies. Hey, go ahead and beat them up. If they're going to throw tomatoes, I want you to beat them. I want you to stop them physically, hurt them. I'll pay the legal fees. Don't worry about it.
In the past, we'd carry them out on stretchers.
And here's the thing. Not only are we going to demand right here, right now, that you disassociate yourself with him, cut all ties with Lewandowski, but at the same time, you still have to hold up your end of the deal of providing compensation for legal fees, because he's going to need a whole lot of compensation for those legal fees. You put the rhetoric out there. If you say you're going to do what you're going to do, you make these promises that you're going to stand behind what you say. Guess what? Put up or shut up.
Prove it.
Prove it.
And that's the other thing. You need to disavow those followers of yours that you worked up into a frenzy that went out and punched that black protester in the face. You incited
violence. You committed a felony for the simple fact when you said you'll pay their legal fees. That is enticement. That is felony coercion, is what you're doing. You should not even be allowed to run as president.
And the violence you incited has sparked race riots in the city of Chicago and the city of St. Louis, Missouri. Right now, people are at risk because of your reckless behavior.
What you did is no different than the Black Panther Party calling for and putting a hit out on George Zimmerman. Putting up money saying that they will put up X amount of dollars for someone to go and take out George Zimmerman. It's no different. It's no different. It's solicitation of a criminal act is what you have done. Period.
Not to mention terroristic threat as well.
So, Mr. I'm a winner, guess what? Just makes you a 10-time loser right there. Again.
And folks, you know we're not friendly to these protesters, but they have a right to do it.
And you know what?
They suffer the consequences for it. But guess what? You infringed upon their right when you attack them.
And I'm going to make this statement right now. If this was going on in Ted Cruz's camp and campaign, we would be making the same demands, the exact same demands. Why? Because you want to talk about equality, equal protection under the laws. You violate somebody's rights. I don't care who you are, what political bent you are, how constitutional you may be or think you are. You infringe upon people's rights. You have lost all credibility. You no longer represent the Constitution. Period. That goes for everybody across the board.
Yep. And we are equal opportunity with respect to that. And you see, folks, this is why we come out and do these shows. This is why we share the message that we do. We want you to be empowered, but we also want you to respect the rights of others. Just as we would respect your rights, we ask that you respect our rights. That's the way this country was meant to be. And it is our duty and obligation, because every fundamental and inalienable right that was endowed to us by our Creator is couched with a duty, obligation, and responsibility. And it is our duty and obligation and responsibility to promote, to proactively safeguard, and to protect not only our fundamental and unalienable rights, but those of our fellow citizens. That is what a representative republic is. And with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back for one last round of alcohol. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I'm your captain, Randy Wright, and as always, I'm joined by my first officer, Jeremy Grapington. We would like to take this opportunity to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. We also invite you to leave any questions, comments, concerns, or what have you, either here on our YouTube page or on our Facebook page or our Google Plus page. We also invite you to follow us on Twitter with the Twitter handle of @RadioAviationEX, @RadioAviationX. Folks, that's all one word, @RadioAviationEX, @Radio Aviation EX. And there you'll find our departure board, which will link you to both Jeremy and myself and to our Cafe Press account. Go ahead and show us some support. We have some wonderful products out there. If you buy into that, that'll help us continue making these shows and to bring you this state-of-the-art radio program that we always do. Once again, folks, thank you for flying the Wright Flyer. We will see you next time. Do take care.